Hey guys, it's Divest. So today I would like to make a deep dive into explaining why I dislike the Lee Enfield and why I think it's the worst weapon in its class. Now to start with my background, for those of you who don't know, I'm a German gunsmith who helped design various modern military firearms. But you really don't need to be an expert to understand this topic, so I'm going to try and avoid making a fallacious argument from authority here. With that out of the way, the Lee Enfield is the primary service rifle of the British from the World Wars and various smaller conflicts they fought in the late 19th and 20th century. It's probably one of the most beloved rifles with history nerds, especially in the English-speaking world. So there is a lot of mythology around it, in spite of the memes. If you actually look at the history of the adoption of the Lee Enfield, it wasn't a very successful rifle. In practical terms, there was a single user for the Lee, which was Britain. Everyone else who used the rifle did so because of their relationship to Britain, whether they were being armed by or captured it from the British. Out of all the countries in the First World War, not a single one decided to standardize on the Lee Enfield after using it, despite its mythical status. Meanwhile, after the First World War, Romania, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Belgium, and Yugoslavia all adopted the Mauser 98 as their standard rifle based on their combat experience during the First World War. This isn't unique to the Lee Enfield, but the fact of the matter is that bolt-action rifles like the Mosin Nagant, Liebel, and Carcano, that are commonly cited as the worst in class, achieved a similar level of international success as the Lee Enfield. In terms of bolt-action service rifles, by the start of the 20th century, Mauser had an effective monopoly on the market. If you weren't being armed by a major European power, then you used a Mauser, because it was the obviously superior bolt-action rifle design at the time. All of the major rifles of the First World War emerged during a period of tremendously rapid firearms development, the likes of which has never been replicated in human history before or since. To give you some perspective, in 1850, smoothbore muzzle-loading caplock muskets were modern military arms. 50 years later, we had all of the rifles I mentioned so far. By comparison, it's been about 60 years since the AR-15 became the primary weapon of South Vietnam aligned forces as the M16, which is still a modern weapon with some minor alterations. This rapid advancement in technology meant that armies had to rush the development and adoption of their rifles in order to remain competitive with their rivals. This meant design flaws were missed or ignored during development. All of Europe's major powers settled on a modern smokeless repeating rifle that they had rapidly developed to catch up to the French by 1892. But after this had been accomplished, Mauser was still refining military rifle designs for export to nations that didn't have the resources to design their own weapons, so they had another 6 years to figure things out with the Mauser 98. Hence why they were able to fix the issues plaguing the first generation of smokeless rifles. Because of the sunk cost in pouring so much money into rapidly fielding these now slightly obsolete wonder weapons, most countries didn't bother with replacing their first smokeless rifle. Hence why the Mauser 98 didn't become a universal weapon, at least until bolt-action rifles were relegated to the niche of sniper weapons. But the number of countries that didn't adopt a Mauser rifle when selecting for new rifles after this point can be listed on one hand, and in fact the Brits wouldn't even land on this list. The Brits were definitely aware that the Lee Enfield was an inferior weapon too. During the Second Boer War, the Brits found themselves outgunned by the Mauser rifles of the Boers. This led to a program by Enfield to design a new military rifle to replace the Lee Enfield with a reverse-engineered Mauser rifle. But unlike in Germany or the United States, the Brits drug their feet, and so the British Mauser rifle, the Pattern 13, wasn't ready for mass production until halfway through the First World War, so they were forced to rely on the obsolete Lee Enfields instead, despite the narrative around it, which goes something like, the Americans had a hunting rifle, the Germans had a parade rifle, and the Brits had a battle rifle. The Lee Enfield didn't redeem itself in the First World War. Britain just didn't have the willpower or funding to introduce a new rifle after the monumental sunk cost of mass-producing their obsolescent rifle during the First World War. And by the next time they were willing to update their arsenal, automatic service rifles were the new standard, so the Mauser was no longer a good investment. Now that we've got the history lesson about why the Brits failed to replace the Lee Enfield, it's time to go over the mechanical reason why the Lee Enfield sucks. The Lee Enfield has a series of minor mechanical shortcomings compared to a Mauser rifle that aren't really worth discussing, like the rim jamming or being inherently less accurate. But these don't make the rifle suck in such substantial terms. The two real problems with the Lee Enfield are its unsafe locking action and the cost and complexity of the design. The Lee Enfield started out as cutting-edge firearms technology in the 1870s. When Scottish-born naturalized American inventor James Paris Lee, the inventor of the box magazine, designed a bolt-action rifle around his magazine for the Sharps Company of Sharps rifle fame. Because of the lower pressure peak of black powder, James was more concerned about fouling from the black powder ammunition, so he used rear-locking lugs which wouldn't get gunked up, but also turned the bolt into a lever against the locking surface. This means that the amount of force the bolt is subjected to during firing is multiplied compared to the front locking lugs of other rifles. In addition, the Lee only has two locking surfaces, so if one fails, you suddenly lose half of your locking strength, whereas the other major rifles of the war used a third lug or the bolt handle as a redundancy. Then add on to that the fact they tripled the pressure peak when switching from black powder to modern smokeless propellant. On top of which they had quality control problems that meant you could get pressure spikes up to twice as high as what the .303 cartridge was supposed to be loaded at. You had rifles blowing up all over the place, and when they did, they could shoot the bolt back into the face of the shooter, and oftentimes, due to the sensitive nature of the cordite propellant, they would detonate the magazine too. So rather than just losing a rifle, you crippled or killed the operator. That was the impetus for replacing the Lee Enfield after the Boer War. The Pattern 13 was designed to use a Mauser action because the Mauser had an extremely strong locking action intended by design to withstand 860 megapascals, or 125,000 pounds per square inch for you Americans, which is why you can scale up the Mauser bolt action for anti-material rifle cartridges. That was also why the Ross rifle was created. It uses interrupted screw threading more akin to an artillery piece than a rifle, with 6 locking lugs. We remember the Ross rifle as a piece of shit, but the only difference between it and the Lee Enfield was that you could assemble the Lee Enfield correctly and it would still blow up in your face, where you had to mess up assembling the Ross for the same effect. Economically, the Lee Enfield also required much more work per rifle produced, which meant a slower turnover compared to the Mauser. In fact, the Lee Enfield even compared unfavorably to the M1 Garand during the Second World War in the time it took to manufacture. While the Garand required a lot of extra work for its automatic reloading, it came out ahead once you included the quicker fabrication of the bolt, magazine, and stock compared to the Lee Enfield. Finally, one of the most prevailing myths about the Lee Enfield is that British riflemen were able to fire their rifles faster than the Germans, which is also just completely false, if you've been paying attention. The British adopted a rifle that required their soldiers to play a game of Russian roulette every time they fired it, and didn't manage to meaningfully address that issue for 60 years because they didn't care enough to invest the resources to fix it. That is antithetical to the idea that British soldiers were elitely trained compared to their counterparts in other nations in the First World War. That would be like giving every soldier in your army the same training as a Green Beret, and then issuing them with a bomber vest. The reality was that the British Army was underfunded and limited on practical experience or doctrine. The only major combatants before and during the First World War that seriously trained their riflemen were Germany and the United States. The British Army diminished the value of the riflemen even more, based on their experiences in colonial wars and observations of the Russo-Japanese War. The rifle was in their minds a handle for a bayonet, and there was some valid reason for thinking that way. In a colonial conflict, massed assaults by natives armed with primitive firearms or melee weapons would be mowed down by machine guns. If masked natives got close enough, you would want to have a block of infantry forming a spear wall to protect the machine gun. On a man-to-man level, if a British rifleman encountered a native, then he would either outshoot the musket or spear-armed native with his superior technology, or the native would ambush the British soldier, at which point bayonet drills would be more important than his shooting skills. Similarly, in the case of the Russo-Japanese War, infantry was massed to storm and defeat a machine gun position or to defend the machine gun against massed infantry. So their efficacy with their rifles was less important, because they would never meaningfully impact the volume of fire on a beaten zone like skilled machine gunners would have, and similarly, being able to operate their rifles with alacrity wouldn't give them an advantage standing out in a field getting mowed down by machine guns when they went on the assault. The only thing that really mattered was if they could defeat the enemy infantry in melee to silence the machine guns. It's also claimed German soldiers confused Lee Enfield fire for machine guns during the Battle of Flanders. This is also false. I dug up the original quote that Barbara Tuchman referenced in The Guns of August, where the Prussian officers said they came under fire from rifles and machine guns. This is based on the assumption that the British Expeditionary Force didn't fight with machine guns in the opening weeks of the Great War, misinterpreting the fact that the BEF didn't embark with Vickers machine guns. But the earlier Maxim machine gun was in use, so the Germans came under fire from rifles and machine guns, hence why he identified the two different classes of weapons. Plus, if you've ever heard massed rifle fire, it sounds nothing like a machine gun. Machine guns have consistent rates of fire, so it sounds like an idling car engine with its steady noise, while the randomness of a dozen men firing repeating rifles makes it sound like popcorn popping on the stove. Any infantry officer in the German army would be able to tell the two apart, having been trained alongside both weapons. It also doesn't seem plausible if the British soldiers were so awesome with their rifles that they left survivors from an infantry column to comment on their shooting. In fact, I believe that guy in particular survived unharmed, and his unit routed the Brits who were shooting at him, because the Entente nations were defeated in Flanders. Also, British soldiers weren't trained to operate the trigger with their ring finger. That was a technique developed by Danish competitive shooters wielding Krag Jorgensen rifles that was adapted to the Lee Enfield. You can see plenty of photographs and films showing they used a conventional grip throughout the service life of the rifle. By the way, it's a bad idea to rely on a weaker muscle to fire your rifle in a highly stressful life or death situation, and you can do the same thing with a Mauser with a bent bolt handle. Not only were British soldiers mediocre in terms of the quality of their musketry, but the design of the Lee Enfield isn't super conductive to rapid fire from a bolt action either. It's about on par with the Mauser overall. Both designs have their own merits when it comes to rapid fire. Before you sight him, Bloke on the Range's Mad Minute test with the Lee and Kar 98K is flawed for a few reasons. First off, the original guidelines for administering the Mad Minute test state that it should be conducted starting with an unloaded rifle, because loading the rifle is part of the rapid fire process. But Bloke starts with loaded magazines, which means he can skip one reload on the Lee Enfield. There is some merit to the fact that the Lee has a higher magazine capacity, but the Gewehr 98 was also issued with 25-round extended magazines. So if you started with one of those loaded, you would need to perform 3 less reloads than starting with a loaded Lee Enfield, which would inevitably push you over the edge between two similarly proficient shooters. Secondly, he obviously doesn't know what he's doing with the Kar 98K, and that rifle was in rough condition, which made it more comical than anything. Since we can't trust the perfidious Brit, I will tell you that my performance with the Mad Minute for the Lee or Kar is about the same. At most, I'll save tens of milliseconds between shots using the Kar 98 because it's faster to reload. I did find another YouTuber, Dergreif, who fired 5 rounds and reloaded the Gewehr 98 in 9 seconds. Unfortunately, he didn't fire a full Mad Minute, but based on that time, he would easily be upwards of 30 rounds per minute, which is about where I am with the Mauser 98. So the trade-offs between the two systems when it comes to rate of fire is that the Gewehr 98 has a longer bolt throw, but in exchange it's a much smoother action that is less likely to bind compared to the Lee, which has to deal with rimmed ammunition. The longer length of the Gewehr bolt means that it's going to be less ergonomic if you're a manlet, but if you're average or above average for male height in a Western country, then you won't even really notice it. The final supposed merit of the Lee Enfield was its shorter length. But this was not unique to the Lee Enfield, nor was it an upgrade over long rifles. Both systems had their own merits, which is why the Germans retained the long rifle as their standard arm, with the short rifle as a supplementary design. I have another video explaining why that is. Also, there isn't a dichotomy between having a carbine and a rifle that is safe to fire. Finally, I would like to add, with the benefit of hindsight, I would have accelerated the development of the Pattern 13 Enfield. It is legitimately the best rifle of the First World War holistically if you consider ergonomics, reliability, accuracy, safety, firepower, and whatever else. I'm sure I'm going to get a lot of Brits who didn't watch the whole video whining about supposed German chauvinism in the comments section, but I really don't care about the nationality of a rifle, just its real-world performance. Although rather than designing a new Enfield cartridge, I think the 7x57mm Mauser cartridge on the Boer rifles was a better solution than the British attempts to standardize on a Magnum rifle cartridge at a time when Spitzer bullets already allowed rifles and machine guns to kill people over the horizon. I also prefer cock on open to cock on close. Thanks for listening. I hope you found this explanation enlightening. Let me know if you learned anything in the comments section below, or especially if you're salty and you want to argue with me. Until next time, this has been Divest.